Hello, everyone, and welcome to Literary Tales. I'm your host, Paul Krause, and in this episode, we complete our examination of Cicero's Republic by turning to his views on education and humanism and how they impact politics. Besides political commentary, Cicero's other great undercurrent of thought in the Republic is the relationship between philosophy and education with the health of one's soul, and how this pursuit of wisdom impacts how one acts and engages in the world of the political. Naturally, this of course has consequences to political philosophy, which is the main umbrella that the work deals with. As we turn our attention away from the strictly and explicitly political in Cicero, we now turn to his tremendous legacy in the formation of educational theory, his view that philosophy is the handmaiden to healthy living and society, and his supposed contributions to an early form of philosophical humanism. For education, Book 3 and what's left of Book 4 of the Republic details Cicero's concerns on the matter, as does Book 5, of another one of his famous dialogues, the Tusculan Disputations, which I'm also drawing from. Throughout Book 3 of the Republic, Cicero moves into a lengthy dialogue with Philus and Laelius concerning the roles of wisdom and justice, injustice, and their roles in society and that of the state. What emerges between these two characters is a dispute over the nature of wisdom in society and what role wisdom plays. This leads us into Book 4, in which Cicero explains his views on education, philosophy, and the humanities in general, and their role in producing a healthy, literate, and educated society, which he thinks is necessary for the health, stability, and justice for any social and political order. It is important to remember that, for Cicero, there are two poles of the human being, two sides. The first is the rational, intellectual, and thinking side, the rational human being. This is the man who is fully alive. The alternate to this is the brute animal, as he calls it, people who are ignorant, suppress their intellect, and consider themselves, like the vulgar youths he criticized in Book 1, mindless imbeciles, who think highly of themselves despite living a life akin to an oyster. These are the two poles of humanity, of which philosophy and the arts, when humanized and given philosophical substance, do battle with, according to Cicero. For Cicero, the humanized arts call people away from being brute animals. They awaken the intellect and thinking and the virtue within people through the pursuit of wisdom, from which knowledge and virtue emanate. As he states in Book 3, their minds rose higher and succeeding in achieving, in thought or action, something worthy of what I have previously called the gift from the gods. That gift of the gods, by the way, is rational thought and speech. This is common throughout ancient philosophy and early Christian theology. The great men, according to Cicero, are not conquerors, but the philosophers, those who bring light to the human mind, which illuminates our world and allows for the cultivation of virtue from said knowledge. They are the great men. Just as it was with Plato and Aristotle, who both maintained knowledge was the first principle for cultivating virtue which leads to rightful action, Cicero is also in agreement. Hence my opinion that anyone who achieves both objectives, familiarizing himself with our native institutions with theoretical knowledge, has acquired everything necessary for distinction. The purpose of coming to know both the native institutions of Rome and universal philosophical wisdom is to allow one to act, so one knows how to act in accord to the situation they find themselves in. It is very reminiscent of Aristotle. This combination of practical virtue, understanding the roots and institutions of Roman life, as it is particular to Cicero, and intellectual virtue, philosophy in general, leads to the fullest embodiment of wisdom, according to Cicero. And it is here that Cicero makes a lengthy discussion on the nature of justice and whether politics benefits from injustice or justice. This is another philosophical treatment of the nature of justice to which Cicero opts in favor of a just state having more benefits than a politics that is built on injustice, contra Thrasymachus and the Sophists in Plato's Republic. This discussion doesn't concern us, however, for this post. We need to continue focusing on education and philosophy and how that impacts politics. Because Cicero lived in a time when most laws, institutions, and the understanding of politics was undergirded by philosophy, he maintained that the study of wisdom was integral to the preservation and the preserving of the inheritance and the modification, properly speaking, for greater stability, order, liberty, and merit of any existing order, however imperfect it is. Cicero believes that a lack of education leads to a general barbarism within society. As he said, too many people now, in their folly, want to get rid of this admirable system. Unfortunately for us, Book 4 is in the worst shape of all the surviving manuscripts. What has been preserved is gathered from fragments of Cicero's original work, which was found in the Vatican Library, and from St. Augustine's commentary in the City of God, from which he quoted Cicero extensively. Some of those quotations, taken from Augustine, have helped us fill in the missing parts of Book 4 of Cicero's Republic. In Book 4, Cicero turns now to a critique of the elements of Greek culture that he sees as anti-intellectual and stoking the passions of the masses, theater, plebeian rallies, and what we today might call safe spaces or positive reinforcement about our own beliefs and actions. Cicero harshly condemns the notion that anyone should be praised simply because they are a living person. You shouldn't praise anyone just because they're alive. Frankly, you shouldn't praise anyone just because they take a, quote, principled stand for something. If the principled stand is for something evil or wrong, that is not worthy of any admiration. Those who are to be praised based on their intellect, their merit, and their accomplishments for society, rather than being able to whip up the plebeian passions and emotions into a frenzy from which one indulges and has a sort of gratuitous adoration from an irrational crowd or a group of sycophants. Cicero's condemnation of the vices that he sees in Greek culture rests on his insistence on education. Theater, plebeian gatherings, and positive reinforcement all prohibit the development of the intellect, according to Cicero. In theater, people lax their intellect and allow themselves to be swayed by the passions of emotion and allow themselves to be corrupted by others. For example, I should laugh because everyone else is laughing, even though I might not have actually found the moment that everyone is laughing about to be humorous or worth laughing for. Plebeian gatherings, Cicero says, often results in the same and leads to positivity among the crowd. Cicero maintains that genuinely bad ideas are subsequently praised in the madness of the crowds, and those with poor intellects are heralded as visionaries and geniuses, which is, of course, a corruption of the intellect, if there ever was such a thing. Here it should be maintained, Cicero is not arguing for the absence of any of these things in society. He merely maintains that they have their proper, limited place in society and that they should not overtake society. In other words, Cicero would be horrified by the entertainment and the infotainment culture of modernity as a perverse corruption of natural reason and what it means to be human. For our species is not made up of solitary individuals or lonely wanderers, as he said all the way back in Book 1. Cicero's main concern for education is the maintenance, but also the inherited understanding of the communities by which people come into the world. Hence the statement that those in their folly desire to destroy admirable, albeit imperfect systems. One is lost in a sea of ignorance and confusion, which causes him to lash out in a fit of rage and iconoclasm, which brings immeasurable harm to society in general, to satisfy his outbreak of ego. Cicero also believes the negative or harmful sides of culture and that they can be tamed by education. Basically, art and drama do have their place in society despite the harm that they can bring, and that the harm that the Greek dramatists did bring by a philosophical understanding of the purpose of art, drama, and theater. The purpose of art, literature, and drama should be primarily intellectual rather than the purgation of wild passions. Art should teach, heal, and grow the human being in understanding himself and understanding the form of beauty, wisdom, justice, etc. Art directs the intellect up toward heaven, in other words, rather than indulging in the fantasies of the passions and the emotions, like Dorian Gray in Oscar Wilde's great book, The Picture of Dorian Gray. To this end, Cicero expounds on the necessity of moral education through the humanizing of the arts. By that, he does not mean to install via education values into people. Cicero, being a believer in the natural law, believes that such values are inherent to people and to the human species itself. Like many other philosophers before him and after him, Cicero understood the idea of natural law as something intrinsic within the rational order of human beings. The purpose for education is for the cultivation of the intellect. Education and the cultivation of rationality are important to understanding and expounding law, coming to know thyself, and subsequently understanding what the natural law is. As Cicero writes, law in the proper sense is right reason in harmony with nature. Cicero believes that through education in the humanities, a term he coined, philosophy, literature, and the arts, people can properly balance the major intellectual streams and come to an understanding of nature and therefore act in accord with natural reason. Achieving this, much like achieving one's telos, is what is meant by morality. As we've discussed before with Cicero, the moral law is the natural law, and all education and understanding brings us to virtue and morality. Failure of education in this manner leads to corruption, a corrupt rationality, leading to folly, which then exhausts itself in humans through a desire to destroy rather than maintain. It follows in that order. Corrupt rationality leads to folly and ignorance, which leads to a desire to destroy rather than inherit and modify. Therefore, from Cicero's observation, the collapse of rigorous intellectual education leads to the retardation of civilization and culture, which may eventually lead to its ultimate demise and destruction. Thus, education is a bulwark against instability and chaos. More importantly, Cicero considers education to be a meritorious endeavor. And here, if you recall from our episode on politics and constitutional theories in government, Cicero was a great fan of merit. The allure of education would naturally draw out the meritorious, intellectual, and rigorous in society. Through that education, no matter where they came from in society, the best and brightest of society would be the best equipped to maintain the order of the communities they grew up in and understand that their love of self, community, country, and wisdom should necessitate concern for the well-being of their own communities. As Cicero again said at the very beginning of Book 1, I simply state this basic fact. Nature has given to mankind such a compulsion to do good and such a desire to defend the well-being of the community. Throughout the Republic, Cicero praises those who devote their life to politics. Here we must again understand that by politics, just as it was for Aristotle, this is not equivalent to our modern understanding of politics via ideology, what Aristotle called the man of action, whom we today would call the activist. Politics, practiced in this sense, is working within or for the political order that safeguards stability, justice, peace, and the security for communities, rather than trying to change the system from the outside, which often leads to destruction. Politics is about the preservation of the political order that has been established, passed on, modified, and inherited over generations, rather than a medium for the promulgation of ideology and the working toward an idealized eschatological end of history. Cicero also believes that through education, people will be better equipped to be able to work toward the mixed constitution, the mixing of the best elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. In a sense, Cicero can be seen as advocating for an elective form of monarchy and aristocracy in which people will elect their king and ruling elders and aristocrats who will be the most meritorious, intellectual, and deserving of the individuals to lead society. The election, however, would be permanent until the death of such people. Therefore, education is what allows for modifications of political order and civil law to occur with minimal unintended consequences and fallout. More importantly, as hinted already, education helps one understand law. Cicero believes in two sets of legal codes: the natural law, inherent to human beings, and the civil law, which is the laws that rule our communities. These two are not opposed to each other. In fact, they best cooperate with one another. The natural law is the instinctive desires inherent to all species, the desire for happiness, peace, security. The civil law is the law established and codified by humans that, in its best form, ultimately reflect the natural law and best manifest the spirit of happiness, peace, and security among human beings. Education plays a major role in allowing this to happen, but only through the cultivation of the intellect. As Cicero says in Book 1 of the Laws, philosophy helps men understand themselves and their place in the natural order of the world. If the world is rationally ordered through wisdom, then it follows that there is a natural order of the world to which we belong, and our rational capacities help us to understand this natural order and place therein, which subsequently help us understand our relationship to the world, with other human beings, to our communities, which allow us to manifest our role in society, to do good, to help others, and to produce a stable, orderly, and free society. In sum, education, which is principally the study of philosophy, is a humanizing task which has direct consequences for politics. It allows one to understand their humanity rather than their brute animalistic nature. It allows one to cultivate virtue through the attainment of wisdom, which leads to a knowledge of how to act and when to act. Furthermore, education clearly still retains, as we've been mentioning, political overtures. The wise and educated society leads to an engaged citizenry, as Cicero states. But if you recall, all the citizens were both common people and senators. A rota system decided which months they should serve as commoners and which as senators. They received payment in both capacities for attending meetings. The same men heard all cases, including those of capital nature, in the theater and in the Senate House. The Senate had as much prestige as the masses. Again, only an educated, literate, and philosophically inclined society can lead to virtue and the ability to overcome the brutish and foolish ways of plebeian animals and luxury-chasing weaklings who care not for anything besides how they look to the public. The struggle of politics is against those who destroy out of folly, brute animals, and those who cut themselves off from the responsibility of others in pursuit of luxury and 24/7 sensual and material pleasure and gain. All this education and study of philosophy finally permits us to move into a more ideal form and understanding of politics, and hopefully the ability through our virtue, which comes with wisdom, to avoid the shortcomings of the three simple forms of government and our constant abdication of responsibility. As Cicero states quite clearly, the good life is impossible without a good state, and there is no greater blessing than a well-ordered state. The reason for that is simple and somewhat self-explanatory, especially considering the dialogues over the problem of politics in Book 1. A well-ordered state, because of the order that it provides, from which we can reasonably deduce that justice flows, is the state that has an orderly society that is able to pursue happiness and attempt to align themselves in accord with the order of nature to derive happiness without fear, chaos, disorder, or the embrace of hedonism. From this well-ordered society, liberty, equality, and merit flow. In fact, having just concluded the importance of moral education, Cicero opens Book 5 by saying, "For it is not by some accident, no, it is because of our own moral failings that we are left with the name of the Republic, having long lost its substance." When a society is collapsing, it is collapsing because of the lack of moral virtue within its citizenry, which itself is a collapse from intellectual understanding of the natural order from which true moral virtue emanates. Education is also important, not simply in how we should live in society and how we should defend a society, but to the understanding of the ideal statesman and the ideal nature of the political, which Cicero explains through the brief but important and deep farm manager analogy. As he writes, "So a farm manager knows about the nature of the land, and a steward knows how to read and write, but each of them concentrates on practical efficiency rather than enjoying that kind of knowledge for its own sake." Again, this is Cicero's debt to Aristotle. Phronesis, or practical wisdom, is what Cicero believes philosophy and education aims at, and cultivating this practical wisdom makes a good and healthy human. Knowledge is only worthwhile when put into action. Again, this is why education is so important. Once we know ourselves and our place in society, we can act properly. This is true for everyone, irrespective of where they may come from in society. It is somewhat pointless to have a crude knowledge of how to till the land or how to read and write if one doesn't apply that knowledge to real-life circumstances. Therefore, the ideal statesman is much like the farm manager. He knows the matters of the state and political just as the farm manager knows the nature of the land and how to work it. He teaches and instructs and helps to build from those solid foundations. The statesman doesn't get bogged down in menial tasks and other such affairs, but has responsible people, such as the steward, who would keep track of matters relevant to the farm manager in order to run the state. As Cicero writes, "He will be well versed in the fundamental principles of law. He will have some grasp, too, of civil law, but only in the sense that a ship's captain will have a grasp of astronomy and a doctor of natural science. Each of these men draws on those areas of knowledge in practicing his skill without being diverted from his particular business." Basically, the ideal statesman must be well versed in just about everything, which is why he needs to be a philosopher. This is Cicero's equivalent of Plato's philosopher king. Through this knowledge, like a farm manager's estate, the statesman protects the land, provides for the land, sustains the land, and knows how to use all of these things while having others work the land, keep track of finances, and so on, effectively having an administrative bureaucracy tasked with running the minute details of life that keep the ideal statesman above it and not bogged down with those menial tasks. While Cicero has clear intentions to his own time as the Roman Republic was threatened, his cautionary tale is one that any educated person has read and takes seriously. Although the Republic is a small dialogue, given the porous state that it is in, it was widely influential throughout the history of political philosophy, and even theology. Much of it was integrated into Catholic political thought, especially in St. Thomas Aquinas. Two of America's founding fathers, as we've mentioned in an earlier episode, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, considered themselves disciples of Cicero. A cursory reading of Cicero's great work, however, is not enough. There is so much going on in between the lines, with serious implications concerning human nature, the cosmos, metaphysics, ethics, and political philosophy, as well as history. We would be wise to retain the classics and reread Cicero again and again and again. And hopefully, these few lectures on Cicero's Republic will help you have that foundation to begin rereading Cicero again and again and again. The moral person, according to Cicero, is not the person who seeks to transform the world. The purpose of morality is primarily for the health of one's soul, the intellect, and to be a virtuous individual, which is wrapped up with the teleological flourishing and happy human being in a life in community. The moral person is the virtuous person who comes to defense of that which is already good and beautiful against those who in their folly, nihilism, or passionate outbursts threaten to destroy the good and the beautiful. Morality is about opposing one's internal lust for domination, not the twisting of a moral compass to give oneself license to reform, to dominate, and to transform, to abuse others in the name of moral enlightenment or progress. It's easier to blame the world or others than to look at oneself in the mirror and change oneself and to begin changing society through one's own self-transformation. Cicero is asking us, what are we willing to do to confront the forces of nihilism, chaos, and tyranny? What makes us truly human for Cicero is the cultivation of our intellects, which leads to the development of moral character, the embrace of the highest calling of the human being, which is to defend our communities and to have an engaged life in politics. Being human is, in fact, a task with major responsibilities. It is no surprise, then, that Cicero sees most humans as basically rejecting their own humanity and becoming brute animals who need not take responsibility for themselves, others, or care for the common good. However, this is where education comes in, and education is so important. Education is what allows us to understand ourselves, the world, and our responsibilities therein. And this also impacts politics. For when we know our nature, our place in the world, and our duties and responsibilities, we are called to politics, to defend the good, the true, and the beautiful, to defend all that is noble, to defend our own human nature, which is always at risk of being overwhelmed by the brute animal. Again, given the time that Cicero lived and wrote in, we can see that Cicero's reflections are also comments on the nature of the Roman Civil War. The plebeian masses and their dictatorial leaders have abandoned humanism, education, and moral virtue. Cicero, of course, sees himself as an educated humanist, and therefore a man who understands his duty. This is the struggle of the Republic and the Republican way of life.